If I can get a cup of coffee, I'll tell you.
Okay.
Put this off for a second. In other words, all of this is part of music. All of these things that I've been talking about: politics, sociology, religion, life, liberty, destiny. Although it may seem not to have anything to do with music, has everything to do with music, because the music is the communication of all of this. Poetry, drama.
Let's take some specific, really nitty-gritty
Go ahead.
situations that will come up for you as a teacher, and as a performer too. We'll stick with teaching for the moment, and look at them in light of this framework that we're. Student, you have to audition students, I assume. I assume you're in a position where you have to say yes and no to students who are auditioning for you.
Yes.
And you do that because you have a limited amount of time. And
what am I looking for in a student? First of all,
and also, if you want to talk, if you're ever on a jury, do you do that? Do you do competitions?
Oh yes.
So that, what qualities do you prize? I mean, do you really?
What are the qualities that I would like to see, or that I like to see in a student? Courage, sensitivity to sound. Is that when a person, we communicate only through sound. And if the sound is ugly, if the person doesn't really care what the sound is, it may be like sitting and listening over a period of time to a person who shouts or who screams at the top of their lungs. It's not a very pleasant aesthetic. So a sensitivity to the way a sound is produced and how it's handled. Strength, the strength to play softly, the strength to be able to play strongly without harshness, rhythmic imagination itself, intelligence, the ability to cause me to not change my interest that I have been entered into and held. The entertainment, the entrepreneur. That the person on stage has caught me and will not release me. What the person is actually saying once they have caught me and held me. Performers are very, very rare. You were asking me before we went out and got the coffee. You asked me, how is the concert profession today? Or words to that effect.
Yeah.
The condition of the audience is and always will be people who want to be excited, tranquilized, stimulated, brought into a world that they did not believe existed, taken out of their world, which they know exists around them, given the opportunity to have an experience of a certain magnitude. People have always wanted that. So the audience is there, waiting for someone to come and give them an experience.
So in a student, you want to see that ability to give an experience,
or potentially able to do this. And I personally believe that audience is there waiting patiently, waiting very patiently. Sometimes thrilled by something. Very often not. And it's not the loudness of the voice, whether it be an orchestra or a band, but it is that which captures the imagination of the audience. This is why the so-called rock concerts are producing something for a group of people which is exceedingly valid. This is why they come. Because it is a new form of concerting. It is a new form of expressiveness. And whether it be ennobling or whether it be degenerative, it is producing what a group of people want, and it gives them the opportunity to have a social experience.
How do you see that potential in a student, and you see the courage, and you see the sensitivity to sound, and they're your student, and you are their teacher?
Not really.
Or
Not really.
you're working together.
We're working together.
Okay.
I'm not a teacher. Perhaps you can call me an enabler, not a teacher. I don't really choose the repertoire. I will say to a student, what would you like to play? What would be interesting to you? After all, there are recordings. People listen to recordings. They know what composer excites their interest. I say, what would you like to do? And they generally tell me, and then I say, go ahead and do it. Now, the question is, how does one teach a person like this? Student comes in who has courage. To develop courage in a person who already has courage is to try to put the person into a situation where his courage is constantly being tested, so that he learns, or she learns, to act normally in an abnormal situation. To walk out on stage in front of a group of people, having nothing other than your mind and your memory and your fingers between you and disgrace, that takes a certain amount of courage. So that constantly to try to put people into a situation of performance, so that they learn to be comfortable, so that when courage is demanded of them, they are able to handle that. And to have the strength of their conviction, to be able to not be afraid of doing something which they personally believe is logical and what they think is right. That's very important. Let's say a person comes in and performs something, and suppose I disagree with what the person is doing.
What does that mean? How can you disagree? You simply mean you wouldn't do it that way?
I wouldn't do it that way. And
but you sense that they're doing it out of... Well, go ahead.
No, the person is doing it. I say, why are you doing that? If the person can give me a logical, intelligent, aesthetic reason for it, even though it may be totally different than what I believe, I will say, do it. In other words, to develop the uniqueness of each person. Because the only thing that an artist has is his his individuality. That's the one thing that must never be destroyed, must never be injured, is this individuality.
Have you heard of the sculptors and the gardeners, that metaphor of teaching?
No.
The sculptors are the teachers who treat a student like a sculpture and they chip away until they get what they want. And the gardeners are the ones who kind of let it grow and see what's there. it's a more nurturing approach. Does that mean anything? Does that mean something to you?
No. No, because a sculptor doesn't chip away. A sculptor looks at a block of wood or a block of stone, and within it is the image. All he's doing is freeing it. He doesn't, all he's doing is removing the stone around it, or the wood around that which has been struggling to free itself. So sometimes as a colleague, I may find that there's a certain way that the person wants to free himself from the constraints around him, more or less like Prometheus, and let that giant emerge. It's very important.
Do most students come up against those points where they're hitting against the wall and you help remove it? Is that an image?
No, I show them how to remove it themselves. Because if I remove the wall,
They'll always be
then they'll hate me, because you always hate that which helps you. You must always know how to do it yourself, because otherwise you're dependent. And as soon as you are dependent upon someone or something, as a child is dependent upon a parent, if the parent insists upon always increasing the dependence, the child will never develop and will always dislike the parent for doing this.
Are you thinking about the time when a student will leave you?
Student must always leave me.
You're working towards that moment.
The student must always leave the teacher. Otherwise, the student is bound to the teacher, thereby restricting the teacher's ability to move around, and also restricting the student's ability to break the shackles. Mm-hmm. Once again, what the teacher then does is bind up Prometheus and let the vulture eat his liver.
How long do you work with a student?
Depends. Sometimes a few days, sometimes an hour, sometimes a number of years.
Depends on what?
Depends on how much the student wants to restrict my field of endeavor. Depends on how much a student wants to become dependent on me. If a student wants to become dependent on me, I end the association almost immediately.
Is that a student who wants you to tell him what to do?
Yes. And then returns and does exactly what I've told the student to do. There's nothing worse.
Yeah, that must be boring.
Can you imagine having to look in a mirror all the time? And the student is the mirror of who I am? Horrifying.
Yeah.
Oh. Anyway, I'm not God. I don't create students in my own image.
Let me turn the tables on you. Tell me about your own studenting, your own days as a student. I want to ask you who are your teachers, but I'll ask you from whom you learned about music.
Everyone. Practically everyone. I learned from my colleagues. I learned from my teachers.
Who were some of your teachers?
Serkin was one, Horshovsky another.
And Curtis?
Mm-hmm. Steinberg, the conductor, William Steinberg. My colleagues, listening to performances, primarily in the listening to performances, to find out what I found disturbing and what I didn't like, which is a negative way of doing it. Learning from reading, not about music necessarily. Learning from seeing life, seeing death. Learning from agony. Learning from disgrace. Learning from living.
Everything life has to throw your way.
Yeah. And not being afraid.
Did you have teachers that
who were harmful to me? No. I think everything was a positive experience. Even the most disgraceful things were a positive experience of learning. You cannot learn what is horrible unless you live it. You cannot learn what is pain unless you feel it. To keep a person from having those experiences is to be a bad teacher. How does one speak of ecstasy unless a person has felt it or understood it? How is one going to feel about agony unless a person has felt it and understood it? To a great extent, one of the problems of communication is that people may only produce ecstasy. And there's no way that you can have ecstasy unless you have agony. You must have the opposite to have the pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Without pain, you can have no pleasure. Without pleasure, you can have no pain. And what is delightful about both is you can never remember either, except that you've had them.
remember in the sense of experience?
Yeah.
There are performances, in the sense of music, there are probably performances that are completely ecstatic, but performers who, without contrast.
Before the hallelujah, there has to have been the passion and the tragedy. So you can't have only an ecstatic experience. Imagine to yourself hallelujah for 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
You say, please, somebody push the needle.
It's very difficult, you know, you're a teacher in a school of music, or when I say teacher, because there isn't a better word, and people come to you and they're in their 18, 19, in their 20s, maybe a little older, and you're in this certain place in this certain time, and they're at that certain point in their life, and you're at that certain moments of your life. How can you live life within the constraints of an undergraduate music school?
That's a very difficult question, because you have to work with people within the constraints of that curriculum, which is supposedly to prepare people for doing something. Well, now, to talk about that is to discuss and describe the ways by which people can develop inside constraints. And I'd like to give you...
But life is about constraints, really. I mean...
Just a moment. I'd like to give you the parable of the lobster. The lobster lives within an exoskeleton. And let's say the female lobster, living within its exoskeleton, keeps growing. It doesn't stop growing. It keeps growing. But the exoskeleton will not allow it to get larger than the skeleton itself. Correct?
Okay, I don't know much about lobster.
Well, you've seen lobsters,
Yeah.
and you've tried to eat them, and after they're dead, of course.
Yeah.
And you find that the claw is very hard, and the claw of the lobster inside it is full of meat. How does that lobster get larger?
By pushing against the skeleton,
No,
the exos.
no. What happens is that the lobster molts. At a certain period of time, the lobster, the shell of the lobster breaks open and falls away from the lobster. At that point, the lobster, if it's a male, has dug itself a hole in the floor of the ocean, and lies there and waits until the seawater comes together with that soft inner part, that soft skin of it. You see, once the shell has fallen away, the lobster is totally unprotected and falls prey to its own kind. Other lobsters go hunting for lobsters, and they kill them and eat them.